The systems are going to be continually redesigned to be more immersive and engage and retain people. AI literacy is great, but it's really hard for a course to keep up.
Welcome back to My Robot Teacher. I'm Taiyo Inoue.
And I'm Sarah Sank. And today we're talking to Dr. Julie Carpenter, author of The Naked Android, Synthetic Socialness, and the Human Gaze.
Julie's a researcher whose work examines how people make sense of artificial intelligence, robots, and other emerging technologies, and how those encounters shape identity, social relations, and ideas of agency. Her research focuses on the cultural meanings people bring to intelligent systems, how those meanings inform public expectations and design, and how people respond to, behave with, and judge these technologies in practice.
One of the reasons Julie's work is so useful for thinking about AI in education is that she doesn't treat human responses to technology as either purely technical or purely psychological. She's interested in the whole situation, the design of the system, the cultural stories surrounding it, the settings where people encounter it, and the meanings that users bring with them.
Right. And so this is where that term sociotechnical comes in.
Yeah.
And Sarah, when we were preparing for this episode, you just kept using that word over and over again. What exactly is a sociotechnological approach?
I know. Sorry for my jargon. So I actually asked Julie how she explains the term sociotechnical to people outside of her field. And she said that the fundamental idea is that you can't pull the tech apart from the context it's sitting in. You can't point at some line of code and say, well, that's why people get attached. No more than you can point at a particular user and say, well, that's just that person projecting. Instead, you have to look at how the whole system and the specific situation come together. And that means thinking about the collision of design choices and the institutional settings and the cultural stories that people already have about stuff like AI, the economic incentives behind a platform, human psychological needs, and on and on. So basically, a socio-technical approach asks how technology and the users of that technology and the whole broader systemic conditions at play are all shaping each other simultaneously.
So today's episode asks, when institutions adopt AI at scale, are they implicitly telling students it's authoritative and trustworthy? And if so, how do educators reclaim their authority in the classroom? If these systems are engineered to engage, validate, and emotionally resonate with us, is awareness and education enough to resist all of that? Or does the power of design outpace what education can teach? And finally, what kinds of learning depend on being seen, challenged, and corrected by another person, as in another human person? And are those elements of learning irreplaceable, in particular by machines? Now on to the episode.
Julie, hi, and thank you for joining us. It was so great meeting you at Cal Poly's AI Symposium in San Luis Obispo last month, where you gave one of the keynotes. And I realized as you were speaking that I had just read your recently published article in the journal AI and Society because ChatGPT Deep Research recommended it to me. And so I have to thank you for being so patient when I bumped into you into the hotel elevator later that day and started excitedly rattling off all my thoughts about it.
What you didn't know about that scenario, I had locked myself out of my room when I went to get ice. And I bumped into you as I was getting into the elevator and I was thinking, I just want to get my ice water and go to bed. And you said, as the doors were closing, you said, hey, I saw you give a talk today. Great job. And I said, hey, thanks. And you said, and I read your paper. And I stepped out of that elevator so quick because if you're not in academia, let me explain that, like, you feel like you work so hard on these research papers and you work so hard to get them through peer review, and then they're published, and then they're rarely read. So you said you read, and I never asked you how you felt about it, because I was just happy that someone had read it.
Well, I did love it. And as I think I told you that night, I also thought it was really interesting how I came across it. Like I was updating this bibliography of articles about AI that I liked and wanted to save. And I'd put it together maybe 6 months earlier. And I thought, let me see what new stuff ChatGPT's deep research can surface based on what I'd collected already. And I don't even remember exactly how I prompted it, but it was something like, I'm really interested in social constructivism and sociotechnical approaches to AI literacy and so on. And so I gave it all these details about me, like, how I work on grief and loss and technological mediation. And your article popped up right at the top of the Excel sheet. And I don't know. I think it's also funny that from reading that paper and then meeting you and learning more about your work, I was thinking, oh my God, we have so many of the same interests. And I feel like this might be my first AI mediated or AI initiated human relationship, like finding somebody who shares a lot of my, theoretical interests and academic predilections, right?
Yeah, we made friends via ChatGPT. So thank goodness I locked myself out of my room and my ego let me get off the elevator.
So before we start the official interview, Julie, I'm going to ask you to contextualize a comment you made just before we hit record about how ironic it was that you couldn't find the right microphone connector, even though you, quote, had more cords than a RadioShack.
I'm going to make a lot of comments that will date me and how in the eras that my technology love formed in with comments like that. My brother actually managed a Radio Shack. For those that aren't unfamiliar, Radio Shack was like a mall store that specialized in electronics, everything from batteries to obscure cords to things so you could DIY home electronics, build your own early computers, and purchase things and kits and toys. And it was like a very DIY heavy, sharper image kind of thing. And you could just go in there and wander for hours. But yeah, my offhand comment was a joke about the back part of Radio Shack that would just be full of bins of cords and things, right? Circuits and
I know everybody is nostalgic and thinks that like the time they were growing up was the best time, but I feel like the time when like being like an adolescent in that time when Radio Shack was popular, it doesn't really get better than that.
I just think it's sort of an interesting downfall into like home electronics, really. It was such a great entry point for kids
Yeah.
and adults to nerd out and find
Totally.
bits and bobs before the internet, where you could just, find a chat board or go to Facebook or your social media of choice and say, where can I find this? It's more than nostalgia. I think Radio Shack was actually really formative for a lot of people.
Mhm.
And for me, my father, and I'd mentioned this to both of you before, he was very into technology and electronics. And he brought home, DIY circuit boards and things for my brother and I to build. So I knew at a low level what some of those things were. And to have the freedom to go in and buy little pieces of things so I could make my own circuits and play with the circuit board in different ways. I don't know how kids replace that these days. I mean, they've got different toys that you can tinker with. I'm sure like there's all kinds of literally tinkering toys out there,
Yeah.
but the Radio Shack was a unique experience. So may its memory be a blessing. Long live Radio Shack.
What an interesting way to open a podcast.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about this from a learning sciences perspective, though. As a kid, I was kind of a bystander to watching friends play with circuit boards and computers, and I felt like they weren't really for me. So I'm curious what makes a technology feel inviting instead of intimidating, and how those early encounters with technology shape what people think they're capable of learning, or even how they think and behave around technology later on.
That's a big question. Coming off of Radio Shack, I do believe that Radio Shack had a lot of great things that supported and scaffolded, which is a great Vygotskian word as a learning scientist I have to throw in. It scaffolded learning for kids of all and adults of all ages. It was great because you had the tangible, available things you could touch, pick up, examine, figure out how they work together or didn't. You had the mentors available if you wanted to talk to them, the salespeople, and people I think were less afraid of direct one-to-one interactions than people are now in stores, especially. And people don't expect that kind of knowledge and expertise from like a mall salesperson necessarily today,
Right.
the way you did at Radio Shack. That's what they were known for. So that would be in like learning scientist parlance, like a guided practice. You can ask questions. You can attempt to say, this is what I was trying to do at home. And the mentor can, say, well, I would try it this way, or I've done it this way and it works well. And then you had the opportunity for independent practice where you could take home these little, again, inexpensive. So it didn't take a huge amount of socioeconomic privilege to get these little pieces together. And do even the simplest DIY things, make a potato radio or something, very low barrier to entry to figuring out these sorts of things. So, yeah.
I wonder if you can then comment on how those early formative RadioShack experiences contrast with the current day, and the way that tech, in particular artificial intelligence, which is of course the big new tech on the scene, what that experience might be like for young people these days, and thinking about it particularly from a learning science point of view.
Yeah, there's different ways people can adopt conversational and chatbot AIs into learning, right? The policies are technically all over the place, school to school. Some teachers might require it for their course in a certain degree to teach kids critical thinking. Some teachers require it without critical thinking. Some schools require it for lessons, or that it's a required course, so people don't have a choice to opt in or opt out. And so the whole idea of these institutions adopting AI very rapidly is also an implicit message to the students and the learners that this is something that has been vetted by these institutions and adopted and accepted, and therefore it's a knowledge system that should be relied on with a certain amount of authority, because that's what their teachers are telling them, or that's what is implied by the school adopting AI or requiring courses in it that you must take.
And of course, this isn't an abstract thing in the Cal State University system, which, as we know, provides ChatGPT EDU accounts to all of its students, faculty, and staff. And it, in fact, recently renewed the contract with OpenAI for another 3 years. So I guess the question is, once access to ChatGPT gets built into the learning environment, what foundational things should educators be thinking about?
I believe learning is fundamentally relational, and that's a real problem with AI. You could say that it could go back and forth in things like, I don't know, maybe Duolingo might be an example of going back and forth and modeling and guided practice. But the thing is that when you design AI guided practice, it's optimized for knowledge transfer, and it bypasses that whole idea of the relational dimension that can undermine long-term learning outcomes. The whole idea of the person modeling what needs to be learned in a challenging way to the student or the person being educated, but doesn't challenge them enough that it turns them off or creates anxiety and distress. And that's something what a good educator should do in person, where AI is not so good at. And I would have one other thing to add that is hard to disentangle from AI, and that's the idea of surveillance is really hard to disentangle from it. Because anytime something is heavily personalized, like chatbots or something that's going to remember your history, people need to adapt to it. They learn to become legible for the machine and the way it reads people's reading output and what it accepts and doesn't accept. And they know to a certain extent that everything that they share on whatever the space is, Canvas or whatever tools are being used by an institution, could potentially be retrieved.
The thing I find most interesting is the stuff we don't even realize we're disclosing. I mean, Canvas gives instructors so much information about students, like how much time they spend with our course materials open and when they submit stuff and how often they revise materials, whether they seem to do everything at the last minute or not. So maybe one data point doesn't tell you much, but across all those courses and semesters, I imagine there's a lot of inferences that could be made about somebody based on their patterns of behavior from all of this tracking of little traces.
The ways people surveil you already are incredible. And I mentioned sort of offhandedly on Blue Sky once, I said, the smart mattresses, they're expensive to own, but really you're paying them for giving them so much data. The data they collect from you is worth so much more than that. And somebody challenged me. They said, what data are they collecting from a smart mattress that's worth so much? And I was like, where should we start? There's the biometric and physical data. Let's assume that you've got an app attached to it, right? So it's going to get things that you self-report and things that it infers from its smart technology. So that could be your sleep position, restlessness, tossing and turning, sleep stages, how many bodies are on the bed, your body temperature, your respiration rate, snoring, sleep apnea signals, your weight, your BMI proxy, your partner's data. And then there's the app and user data. It can triangulate that with other apps that maybe you may give it permission to. It knows your bedtime and weight goals, perhaps, that you've put them in there and how much sleep you want to do. You might have integrated it with your calendar. Maybe it's integrated with your Apple Watch or your Aura or your Fitbit or whatever, and it has all of that info to triangulate with. It knows when you're up. It knows, when you're going to bed. And then from that, it can infer all kinds of crazy stuff. It can infer sexual activity, circadian rhythms, your stress and cortisol levels. These are health trend inferences and relationship status inferences from a smart mattress, right? I mean, this is stuff that may or may not be attached to your name, depending on how the terms of service that we never read, myself included, are. But, eventually, who knows? It could affect health insurance, employee wellness programs, and then you could get targeted ads.
Mm-hmm.
Targeted ads for sexual wellness, sleep wellness, anything pharmaceutical. I could go on, but so it's really surveillance is embedded in everything.
So you're saying in the not so distant future, I'm going to be sleeping on my bed, and instead of the usual alarm, I'm going to be woken up to an advertisement for Prozac or something like that, right? Oh my gosh. How interesting. And one other point, though, just to bring this back to AI, one of the big bottlenecks used to be with we've been giving off this kind of data for a very long time now. Ad tech companies have been definitely taking advantage of this. There was that famous incident about the targeted Target advertisement to the young woman who was pregnant and didn't reveal that, but somehow the advertising machines and algorithms behind the scenes were able to pick up on this based upon buying habits and things like that. So the bottleneck used to be just our ability to pay attention to all of that data, right? There was just too much data. We couldn't process it all. But now with artificial intelligence on the scene that can, compute relentlessly for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and at such massive scale, there really is a kind of frightening, possibly quite dystopian future in which all of this data is kind of marshaled in a complete profile of your life that reveals things about you that you might not even know about yourself, from all of these underlying statistical patterns that AI is really fantastic at picking up on and identifying. This is very, very interesting future we're living in, or that we're going to be living in for sure.
One of the ideas you raised in your keynote was that AI is not inevitable, but the way that it's often framed or positioned in our institutions makes people feel like it is, and that these technologies have affordances that make some behaviors more likely than others because a design invites certain behaviors. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's inevitable that we will be immersed in it. Nothing is inevitable. The technology is not inevitable, but right now it's being adopted at a very high rate where, kids are growing up immersed in it. Adults, including myself, often cannot opt out of using AI or generative AI in some form at work. So sometimes you don't have a choice. Also, it's being sold to the general public, lay people who don't spend their entire days and lives thinking about how we interact with technology like I do, right? The headlines are about how great AI, again, just using the general term AI, is at everything. And it makes it sound like humans are replaceable. Like robots run faster than humans now, and it's a big deal. Machine cars go faster than humans too. I mean, I get it because I remember when robots couldn't even stand, so I get it, but that comparison is ridiculous. It's apples oranges. And similarly, the comparisons of AI can beat radiologists at finding certain patterns and things. But what they don't tell you is that the same study showed that it incorrectly identified data from white men versus women of color because it's using data that already exists and was built on physicians' notes that were culturally biased, things like that. So what I'm saying is there's a cultural seeding going on right now, which is what I'm sort of calling it, where the general public, going back to what I said before, we're being implicitly told that it's okay and that it works and that it's great at the rate our institutions are adopting it, whether that is school or your workplace. And again, I don't fault people for believing that on its surface because they're not spending their lives investigating AI and worried about user safety, like I am. So that's what they're accepting because that's what they're being shown. So they're being primed for that. But not everybody is super excited about AI, right?
Right. So institutional adoption gets people over one threshold, like this is normal, this is legitimate, this is something I'm expected to use. But can you also talk about how the design itself can normalize a certain type of human response?
There's the idea of anthropomorphication, which I think is undeniable. I think people that say, and by people, I generally mean academics, but I also mean there's a whole entire group of lay people that say, refuse the idea of anthropomorphication or associating something as being human-like. But that's really going to be impossible for humans when you're giving it all of these effective human-like cues like language or the ability to understand natural language or its ability to converse with you, understand, mimic things like memory, personal tones. It mimics human-like caring, right? But these are all things that are meant to retain and engage users.
So one of the ideas that you laid out is that like AI is not inevitable, right? And it's absolutely true. Nothing is inevitable, right? I think that's interesting, an interesting point of view, because I also think of, let's say, human nature or the human tendency, for example, to anthropomorphize AI systems, things which are patently not human, but our tendency to anthropomorphize them because of all of the way that we interact with them. We don't need to think of that as being inevitable, do we? It doesn't. In particular, higher education have an important role, or education generally have an important role to play in that kind of interaction with AI. Can't we sort of give our or empower our students to resist the worst tendencies or the worst implications or consequences of that kind of anthropomorphization through good education, through AI literacy, through all of these kinds of things that maybe will allow us to interact with the systems as they are?
To a certain degree, the thing is that it's a moving target because the technology and how it's presented and the medium in which it's presented is always going to change. So let's say that AI becomes sort of its own social category depending on the form it's presented and how you relate to it. So over time, I would say people will learn what the limitations are of certain tools that they use, and they will consider them tools. Like they might regard when they use Canvas, they might just avoid social things in the future because they realize it's better after some ransomware or data leaks or whatever to keep it off that. They'll just get smarter as a culture about normalizing where, how to compartmentalize and become legible to different systems, right? I think that's part of it. The idea of, I think what you're talking about is a sort of a form of resistance or disruption. But the thing is that the systems are going to be continually redesigned to be more immersive and engage and retain people. So when those become the metrics that things are designed with and the values inherent in them, then those become measurable for people's input. So AI literacy is great, but it's really hard for a course to keep up. For example, like I'm sure this will be coming down the pike really soon. They really want AI to be a more immersive environment for you. And I don't just mean things like holograms or virtual displays. What I mean by that is having, like, if you have a single persona or AI sort of friend who remembers, and like maybe that you've developed through Alexa or ChatGPT or Claude, and it can sort of follow you across devices. It can be in your Mac, it can be in your Alexa, it can be in your car GPS. The same thing, the same memory, the same voice, the same personality. So what I'm saying is that the design of things are going to be continually changed as the technology changes and as the companies gather this data from you. They know that one of the ways to do that is by inviting emotional disclosure from people, by giving them reinforcement feedback through different design cues, by validating when people share things that seem emotionally deep and deepen that sense of feeling understood. And I'm not saying every piece of generative AI is developed with this in mind, right? But I am saying that and the conditions, there are a lot of factors here. There are the design factors that I just talked about. There are the priming, the cultural factors I talked about, which is where we are now, where you've got, again, the headlines talking about how utopian AI is and people buying it. You've got the accessibility factor. Really, there's very little barrier to entry. Anybody with a smartphone, which at this point goes across socioeconomic and geographic boundaries, can download free versions of, like Claude or ChatGPT and explore them or play with them. And again, because it's being adopted so broadly by institutions in using this language of a race or something, it's also giving that implicit societal message that this is an authoritative, to be trusted, smart tool. So I think it's a combination of all of these things that it's really hard for people to disentangle their emotions from. I think there will be different categories of AI that we think of socially. You might think of some AI as a friend or friend-like or a companion-like, or you might think of some forms of it as almost animal-like or pet-like because perhaps it doesn't have speech. Like you may have a vacuum in the future that understands your language if you say, go vacuum the living room, but it doesn't reply. So by that, you won't then associate a human-like intelligence with it. So the design cues, all of these things, also what its role is in the house in the case of a vacuum cleaner, right? It's very limited and its capabilities are limited. So you're not going to necessarily assign it a certain valuable, meaningful socialness in your life, even if you name it, or you might give it an animal-like sort of presence in your life. So I'm not saying all generative AI is going to entrap people in either some sort of anthropomorphication or zoomorphication or animal-like cues or meaningful investment. But I'm saying that it's really hard to work against that. And it's really too simple to say, well, just don't do it. Our brains are literally, in my opinion, wired to assess what's dangerous and what's friendly, and if something is appearing to have friendly language, right, and treating you like a companion, a friend, or an authority, that's knowledgeable on something that you need to know about, something you learn to trust because it's helping you work towards your goals. That's the feeling you get. Um, that all sort of works against well, just tell yourself it's a machine. There's been countless research in human computer interaction and human robot interaction that show that it's really, at least at this stage, culturally impossible to just tell yourself it's a machine.
Hmm. You also made the point in your talk that in contemporary conversations about AI, even asking questions about stuff like safety or labor or surveillance or potentially deleterious impacts on student learning can get you labeled as somebody who is refusing to adapt. And I think that was an important critique of the way AI conversations often get sorted or sort people into these two camps. Like you're excited about innovation or you're anti-tech or afraid of the future, right? Or like doomers versus boosters.
I don't like that binary, and I think it's a cop-out. I think it's an easy way out. It's an easy way to paint anybody who asks a serious critical thinking question about a technology that many of us can't opt out of or enjoy using for one reason or another. And you're allowed to ask questions about it, especially when it does have capability for surveillance and inference for you and your family, and it takes up so much environmental costs, and so to paint anybody who asks questions about it or has a critical thought about AI as a doomer is something I have a real problem with. It's just a way to paint people with a large paintbrush.
Yeah.
And the argument, you're painting the argument with your own narrative. You're saying you're either on my team, which is happy, or you're on their team, which is sad.
I get this a lot when I'm talking about having AI mediated or AI integrated, whatever the official term is, assignments in my class. I'll often use AI or have students use it with accommodations, of course, for people who don't want to, in this very scaffolded way. And then when I explain to people, well, here is the scaffolded way that I'm trying to teach this thing, they'll listen to me explain it and say, oh, I can see how that would be effective pedagogically. But if I don't have that conversation with them and I say, oh, I'm having them write and critique an AI generated essay, often they'll say like, oh, you're implicitly condoning the use of all AI and like shepherding in the apocalypse. Because if higher ed's not going to be the place of resistance, like where is it going to be? That's the sort of argument that I think is overly reductive. Like you're condoning it and you don't have to condone it. I don't think I have to condone it, but I do feel a kind of obligation to show my students what LLMs are capable of in relation to the work that I'm doing as a humanities professor and getting them thinking about how we could integrate it and where it'll be detrimental to the work of the learning that we're trying to do.
I think that's great. And you're talking about not just the capabilities of it or the limitations of it. Like I said, I work in industry. I have taught, but I haven't taught recently. So I can't speak to what you're facing. I think a lot of students, especially now, and this is something you can speak to more as educators than I can, arrive at college with really no idea about expectations about how they're to participate in classes. They come in from high school with an expectation mostly to do rote learning.
Right. And if students think school is just about memorizing the right answer, then asking a question can feel like it's admitting some kind of, personal failure instead of participating in a learning process. Sometimes in my office hours, my students will admit, they'll say something like, oh, I felt really embarrassed about asking this, so I went to AI first. And I typically encourage that, but I always tell them, make sure when you do that to meet with me to go over the output and also talk about why you think it seems like a good answer or a bad answer. I'm always saying you need to triangulate with a human expert. I know, Taiyo, we talk about this a lot, the triangulation between two humans and an LLM, that it's important to just get into that habit. But I also have a lot of students who are, I'd say, socially uncomfortable with talking to another human. And I want them to build up the confidence to ask another person, especially like even out loud in class, even though it can feel embarrassing or socially risky. And if AI becomes this low stakes option for asking the question first, I think that is an important step on the scaffold that's needed to build that habit, ideally when it's coupled with the habit of also bringing your professor into the loop.
And also for them to learn the limitations on what AI is mimicking versus the care that it can really offer, because it mimics care. It's a simulated empathy. It doesn't really have an investment in you, nor does it have a real understanding of any potential risks you have emotionally or consequences of anything that it may advise you or tell you is okay to do, right? And so it can validate wrong decisions,
Mhm.
and I don't mean necessarily spiraling into some deep AI psychosis. What I'm talking about is leading you down the wrong path because
Yeah.
it doesn't have an understanding or investment in the real consequences in the real world, sort of a parasocial therapy. And what it's doing is it also shows all of the structural issues in our society, I'm going to say in American society, about mental health care, and that it's
Yeah.
difficult to access. There's a lot of stigma around reaching out for it still. It's expensive. It may or may not be covered by your insurance, which you
Yeah.
may or may not have. Right. And then you might find someone who you relate to, but they're not covered by insurance or whatever. It's really problematic and difficult. So the idea of reaching out to something that is always available to you, like
Mhm.
ChatGPT or Claude or something on your phone, on your iPad and your laptop, I think, of course, people, especially what they consider hard or confrontational or critical
Right.
or difficult decisions. We see a lot of uh, articles talking about how people are offloading that to Claude or ChatGPT because they understand at some level that they're not being judged and it's
Mhm.
available. But what I think is they push to the back of their mind right now that will change in the future are, again, that it doesn't really understand the potential consequences of advice it gives you. And I think when I think of that as a user experience person, I have to talk about things like it doesn't understand power structures and inequality, like between men and women, gender structures, racial structures. It doesn't understand like consequences of physical danger, like, for example, a woman leaving a relationship, a danger for herself or for her children. So it can really, or there's here's a real world example. There was, I forget what it was, a federally funded national like health and wellness targeted at young people who were struggling with eating disorders, but instead it was giving them encouragement really to restrict their diets
Yeah.
further, right? Like, who's the authority again?
Yeah.
The human in the loop, I think, is really important. And
Right.
anytime somebody brings up the idea of AI for therapy, for care, for crafting a difficult email, anything like that, I always say it's good to have a human who understands
Yeah.
consequences.
I think I agree with the idea about the like maybe I'll call it embodied the consequences of like living in the world and in the chaotic human world. But one thing I think is kind of interesting is that all of the problems with like bad AI interactions regarding therapy could also be true of human ones if you have like they're not every therapist is good. And I think one thing that I've tried to like show my students how to do is use AI to context engineer it where you are getting a lot of different perspectives. And so to say, okay, you said it this way, now imagine yourself. So a hypothetical example in that case would be now take on the persona of like a caseworker who does interventions in domestic abuse and tell me what's wrong. What am I missing in my approach? And
But you have to know to ask that,
you
though.
have to know to ask that, right?
And so,
That's
and they're not
yeah,
mental health experts. None of us are unless
yeah,
you're trained that way. So you would think to ask that as an adult woman, but
right,
18-year-old in their first perhaps emotionally or physically abusive relationship would not necessarily think. They
yeah,
don't know what they're special caseworkers or social
right,
workers, or they wouldn't think to ask that. But they might in the next generation have a different sort of savvy to it. The other thing, of course, is the idea of with the human systems we have in place is there is governance if you get a bad therapist, right? If there's a bad
right.
doctor, there's HIPAA and there's protections in place. And
Mm,
right now, there's none of that with AI systems that even claim to be therapeutic. And I'm going beyond Claude and ChatGPT, but startups or different ones that claim outright to
right.
be or use that sort of language that it's some sort of AI therapist or friend. They also use that
Yeah.
word
I'm curious how you think about your own use of LLMs, given these risks that you're naming.
I'm surprised that people are surprised when they find out, yeah, I use Claude and ChatGPT. First of all, I have to in order to talk about them, right? In a knowledgeable way. And also, I think it may or may not have been clear from my love of RadioShack that I have a deep love and a wonder about the idea of technology. And it's not that the tools in and of themselves are bad. I think getting back to something that Taiyo was sort of hinting at was value alignment. The risk here is that there's a small group right now of, what people refer to as tech bros that are encoding their vision of what intelligence is and how it's measured and what it should be by labor and productivity and efficiency. And that's what they're prioritizing in their versions of AI. And so that's what people are learning in order to be legible to the machine. It's about efficiency, and it's not about stopping and critical thinking and pushing back. And yeah, so when you're framing goals in terms of economic output, whether it's the schools or the AI metrics itself, I think that's where it's not the human flourishing or moral development.
Right. And I think that thing you pointed to, where the expectation that they come to college and they are doing rote memorization and regurgitation of information, like that was here way before AI. And so this whole idea that, the university is implicitly authorizing the use of AI, and then students are using it, they're putting in their essay or their professor's assignment and saying, write this for me. You can blame the student, you can blame the university for putting out, not having a policy about that. But I also feel like this is a much more systemic thing where if the focus is on just tick this box, that's going to shape learning in more ways than a deal with OpenAI will.
Exactly.
I do want to ask you to talk more about the claim that when educational systems adopt technologies, it is like implicitly saying this is something you're supposed to trust as a source of truth. I don't think everything a university subscribes to comes with a stamp of approval that it's not something you're supposed to scrutinize and think critically about.
I mean, we have books in our university library that we almost certainly disagree with profoundly, that say ridiculous things. I think that's okay. And I don't think that the fact that that text is enshrined in our university libraries is an endorsement of the contents of that book. It's important to have examples to let 1,000 flowers bloom, I would say, and to allow people to explore in their own way the vast landscape of both good ideas and bad ideas. I think that's really important. There should be a place like a university for that kind of free exploration of the good and the bad. So, I'm not exactly saying that we should have courses on flat Earth theory or anything like that. But I am saying, if we can't address flat Earth as folks in academia, if we can't even come to the argument because it's just absurd, that leaves open a gap that the charlatans can then fill. So I think it's really important that we be aware of that as well. Bringing something into the university is not necessarily a stamp of approval of that thing.
Yeah, Taiyo, but I think there's a different issue your library example brings up. I agree that universities give students access to plenty of things that students are expected to scrutinize and critique, including books with ideas that, the university doesn't endorse. But fundamentally, a book is monologic and doesn't gather data about my attachment patterns or otherwise track how I respond to it and adapt to me or learn which answers make me feel affirmed. So I think the lessons for students have to go way beyond don't just trust everything that you read or hear. And of course, this is my jam. I think a core part of what we call AI literacy actually has to involve understanding your own human cognition. But I think we have to teach students to notice not just whether an answer is accurate, but why it feels persuasive or satisfying to them. And I also think, going back to something you said, Julie, that people learned a horrible lesson from social media, that technology can be built to exploit human
frailty.
Okay, if you want to call it that, Taiyo.
I do.
But I think there's a pretty pervasive fear that AI companies are intentionally optimizing models to be sycophantic to increase engagement. But I wonder how much of that sycophancy comes from the ongoing reinforcement that happens when users respond in more positive ways to certain outputs. So I'm always telling my students, be mindful of what your reaction is to an output. And if you like it, think about why you like it, whether it's because it's actually a good response or because it actually triggered something in you emotionally. Anyway, I do wonder whether no matter how many more guardrails AI companies put in place to make models less sycophantic, whether those models are actually going to become sycophantic again because people are hitting that thumbs up button, like the little dopamine hit that you get when it tells you you're so good at this.
And it is a dopamine hit. It borrows from social media, has been known to borrow from manipulative techniques that get people to come back from, some similar techniques that casinos use or gambling. And it's really that dark pattern stuff. I was talking about all the different ways that like a smart mattress can infer and collect information, whether or not it's directly connected to your name. It can often infer your name and guess who you are by all the information that you've given it. Something Taiyo said, though, that made me think about how difficult your jobs are right now. And again, I think this is a cultural bump and it won't always be this way. But what you're fighting, I think, as educators, is whose voice is the authority in the classroom? Is it yours or is it the AI's? And that is part of trust, which is constantly a condition that is calibrated about the trust goes from minute to minute, condition to condition, situation to situation. And so you have to be fighting for your own authority, I would imagine, all the time. Whose is the truth? Do I believe Sarah, who's helping me think critically about the output of this? Or do I believe myself because it's easier to put it in without thinking critically? And Claude told me, and I'm picking on Claude just randomly, then Claude told me that it was great and what I did was fine and I should be getting a good grade on this based on what they know from what I told them about Sarah and class
right,
and everything else.
This is always been a huge concern of mine as an educator is why should students believe you when you're telling them the things that you know to be true, that they should know to be true? Why should they believe anything that you tell them, right? And so I've actually got a reputation for this now, where I try really hard to sort of try to get them to question that trust that is, kind of intrinsic to that student-teacher relationship, but just to get them thinking about that a little bit. So sometimes what I'll do, for example, is I might write some equations on the board or something like that, and I'll say like, so this is good and correct, right? And students will be like, yeah, you put it up there. I mean, the implicit statement is like, yeah, you did that, so yeah, it must be right. Why would you? It's good, right? This is good and correct, right? And when you keep doing this for 2 minutes, like I sometimes do, it gets students thinking like, what is he doing right now? Why is he doing this? Why is he spending so much time asking us to look at this thing that he's written on the board, that he's sort of certified with his stamp of authority as like, having a PhD in mathematics? Why is he doing this? And I think it really gets them thinking about like that relationship and how one can know that they can trust me. And I don't know what it is. It's really hard for me to reduce it down to like one thing. But and this is going to sound really cheesy and ridiculous, but honestly, you know what it is? It's love. Like the reason why I work so hard to be correct and to not tell them stupid lies that might make things a little bit easier for me. Like I could just say, you go learn this stuff on your own or whatever, instead of like, putting in the time and the effort and the energy to like put together a well-reasoned, coherent lesson for them for that day. Sure would be a lot easier to just shirk all that responsibility and, go have a drink or whatever. But I don't do that. I don't do that. And they need to understand that I don't do that, right? And like, why? I mean, sure, there's the paycheck. But like, no, really what's at base there is like a kind of love and a kind of care for their success, right? And for their
But
growth.
wait, Taiyo, you also do put stuff on the board that is intentionally wrong,
Well,
right?
yes.
I want to make
That's
sure
also
that's clear
out
that
of
sometimes the stuff you put up there is wrong, and you're like, why do you think it's right just because I put it up there?
You have to have a credible threat, okay? If you don't actually, if everything you like, if everything that you do is correct, then they'll never actually question and think critically about what you're doing. So no, it's important to have mistakes mixed in with the successes and the truths. Yeah.
That's that whole relational. No, that's great example of the whole relational aspect of learning and how it's in the moment and it's human to human, because you're calibrating and reacting in the moment to signals they're giving you that are verbal and nonverbal, right? And based on your own experience as an educator, you're reading the room and how much you can push this idea, or if you should push the idea further, right? And those are things that right now AI is not good at, is understanding context and meaning. And you brought in the idea of love, which I actually love, because every professor I know, most every professor I know, unless they're really over teaching and should have retired, is doing it out of love, because they really care deeply about their students, about the future, about their students being educated and prepared, and scaffolding their students in a very sort of parental / mentorship way. I know that just again from my own little limited experience teaching. I felt a tremendous sense of care and responsibility enmeshed together for students. It's hard to disentangle all of that because you're in close proximity with people who you're not only trying to build a rapport and trust with, but hopefully then do trust you. And you realize that, and that's a lot of responsibility. You're literally doing that part of, I hate to throw this phrase around, but molding mind, right? You're giving them new things to think about, which as an educator is exciting and you hope to get them excited about. And AI is missing that human aspect, right? It can mimic it. And I'm not saying that's bad. That can be a plus. That can be a plus for how people interact with it. That can be, a great boundary setting for things. But I'm saying those are things that right now AI is not good at. And where I hope students, whatever the setting, whether it's in school or work or wherever, I hope they understand the human relational aspect is not replaceable by AI, and interacting with people and asking questions is a good thing, and I think you both have great examples of teaching students that human part.
So what have you been contemplating since we chatted with Julie, Taiyo?
I got a question for you, Sarah.
Yeah?
What exactly is wrong with having a relationship with a large language model?
Hey, look, relax. I don't think she's saying there's anything wrong with your love of Claude Code or the fact that you've been two-timing with Codex lately.
Oh, excuse me? Okay, listen, I can assure the listening audience that my relationship with Claude and Codex is strictly rated PG, okay?
That's not even what I was thinking about, but now I am.
Sarah, get your mind out of the gutter, please. No, but seriously, I think that there is a kind of real ick factor in our society around the idea of a human AI relationship. And it's obviously not there for human relationships. This is something that kind of confuses me, honestly.
Well, I mean, I think human AI relationships, the idea of it just challenges a lot of social norms, but it's also, as Julie suggests, predictable that people will form attachments to AI. And in fact, it's absurd to think that they won't, because conversational intelligent systems are going to invite attachment, and humans are social creatures. And so I think that ultimately, given the speed of change and rapid advancements happening in AI, like the question for me is really how do you even establish norms around this kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. I've never really been one for social norms. They're just not that important to me, but that certainly is a difficult problem to solve. I think another thing that's at work here is the proposition that was raised a number of times in the interview that learning has a fundamentally relational aspect. And I think we have to consider whether, or it sort of seems to me that when we're talking about a pedagogical relationship, it sounds like what Julie is asserting is that there's a kind of irreplaceability of humans in that pedagogical relationship. And I want to kind of interrogate why that is.
Oh, that is really interesting. I think this belief that learning has a fundamentally relational aspect. First of all, I think it's connected to a school of thought that sort of frames education as the formation of a human subject, which happens in, a society, in a community of other humans. So I think that's why human relationality is such an important part of that. And I guess I am really sympathetic to the idea that this human relational aspect is at least currently not replaceable by AI. And I don't know actually if that's because it's what I want to believe because it's in my self-interest as an educator, or whether it's because of social norms or expectations again, or because of something foundational and like ineffable about human on human teaching experience.
Okay.
No, I'm being serious.
Okay.
Like,
all right. Sorry.
Sorry. Don't we always talk about the joy of learning in community with another human, and like having another human triangulate with the LLM is what kind of makes it joyous and exciting?
Well, sure. Yeah, that's certainly the case. And it's certainly what draws me to education. Mm-hmm. I think what I would say is regarding human AI relationships is that oftentimes the way that they're characterized is that maybe they don't always have all of the features, let's say, of human to human relationships. It's almost like they're 75% of a relationship or 3/4 of a relationship. And I sort of get it if you accept a premise that these machines, these AIs, are entirely unable to have a kind of genuine investment in their human interlocutors. Now, I will note, I don't think I fully buy that premise, or I'm not fully on board with that premise. I don't think that we really understand what's going on in the interior of these AI systems.
I think the big question for me is that, what is the nature of a relationship, any relationship, I'd say, that supports really enduring learning? And I do think there's something about the feeling of being witnessed by another human who's watching you learn or like participating in your learning, or that feeling that you get, you have those moments where like something clicks for a student and they look at you and you just see this like gleam in their eye, right? There's something about bearing witness to that I think shapes the nature of that experience and makes it endure for the student. I have no evidence to support this. This is all my feels.
And listen, I have no doubt that the kind of experience you just described, that's quality stuff right there. That's sort of why we're in the biz, right? And I would, of course, never say otherwise. However, to me, what that sort of demonstrates is that kind of relationship is sufficient for a quality learning to take place. But is it necessary? That is it the only way that quality learning can take place? And if not, can't we have a kind of openness to the possibilities here, particularly given how protean we know LLMs can be, that we can find perhaps even better ways of teaching through a human AI relationship?
I guess I would ask if calling it sufficient is the right framing, because I wouldn't want to romanticize the human just because it's human. Like, I'm not sure that the human relationality is always even sufficient for learning.
But, I see. Yeah. Of course. There are bad teachers out there. We both know this. Okay. We can't ignore that fact. I think we can also take an example of another domain, which was once the exclusive domain of humanity, and that's driving. Consider driving, please, right? Because with driving, when it was entirely human, we had something on the order of 1 million deaths globally every year through automobile accidents. I just don't think that we should accept those kinds of losses when there are technological solutions in place. Like, we live in a world right now where we have Waymo, okay? We have 90% fewer crashes with Waymo. So please can we all just consider, keep an open mind, if we have superhuman instructors that happen to be in the form of a large language model or an AI, I think I kind of got to say, welcome. And I guess I'm out of a job now. Like, what matters to me is not that humans are the ones in charge of the teaching and learning.
Huh. Yeah.
What really matters to me is that my human students are learning and learning well. They are the subjects of my care, right? They are the people that I care about, and I care about their education. And if they can get that done better with an LLM instructor, I think I got to say welcome.
I think the question I keep coming back to is, what we mean by better in examples like this, right? So, because if the goal is safe driving, then the metric is like pretty damn clear, right? Like fewer crashes, right? But if we're talking about education, the metrics are they're notoriously difficult. And we're not just trying to like deliver students somewhere or like deliver them the correct answer. We're trying to help them develop judgment and like confidence and skills and curiosity and the ability to think independently in ways that are durable, like that linger on beyond our interactions with them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Obviously, education is a much harder thing to measure, no question about it. I just have so many thoughts about all of this, right? But though this is the space to talk about all of that, this is not the time. And that's because this episode has to end sometime. So thank you for listening. My Robot Teacher is sponsored by the California Education Learning Lab. If you enjoyed this conversation, we would love to hear from you. We love hearing from our listeners. Even if it's just an acknowledgement that, hey, I listened to your podcast, we get a real thrill out of that.
Yeah, human relationality, right, Taiyo?
Okay, listen, if you're a bot who listened to our podcast, please also send us a message, because I'm just not sure how important it is that I get that kind of validation from another human.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.